Good evening, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining me. Tonight, I am here with Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. So, the thrillers of Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child stand head and shoulders above their rivals, according to Publishers Weekly, and according to me as well. Preston and Child's Relic and the Cabinet of Curiosities were chosen by readers in a national public radio poll as being among the 100 greatest thrillers ever written, and Relic was made into a #1 box office hit movie. They are co-authors of the famed Pendergast series, and their recent novels include Bloodless, The Scorpion's Tail, Crooked River, Old Bones, and Verses for the Dead. In addition to his novels, Preston writes about archaeology for The New Yorker and the Smithsonian Magazine. Child is a Florida resident and former book editor who has published 7 novels of his own, including such bestsellers as Full Wolf Moon and Deep Storm. Readers can sign up for the Pendergast File, a monthly, strangely entertaining note from the authors, at their website, www.prestonchild.com. The authors welcome visitors to their Facebook page where they post regularly. Again, that website is www.prestonchild.com, and you can reach them on Facebook at facebook.com/Preston and Child. So guys, thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, Drew.
Yeah. So let's get started with, I think, probably the easiest question, the most basic question, which is, how did you guys get connected? How did you guys meet?
Shall I answer that, Doug?
Yeah, you go first, and then I'll correct you with all the error exaggerations.
What happened was I was an editor at St. Martin's Press in the mid '80s. Believe it or not, they actually had movable type at that point. I was a huge fan of the American Museum of Natural History. I went there on all their behind-the-scenes tours, etc., and I thought maybe when I retired I could write a book about the place. And then I realized that my job is to hire people to write books. It's like a shark. If you don't keep acquiring books, you don't get promoted. Mm-hmm. So I looked around for the person who seemed to know the most about the museum, and that was Doug Preston. He wrote a lot of articles for their magazine about the history of the place. So I took him to lunch at the Russian Tea Room and pitched the idea, and he liked it, and he was ready to write a full-length nonfiction work at that point, I think, and that turned into the book Dinosaurs in the Attic, which is still in print and still sells really well. And after that, we decided, Doug was kind enough to give me a behind-the-scenes tour of the place, the kind that most people don't get, and it scared the hell out of me, especially since it was late at night, to sneak me in. And I told him, Doug, this is the scariest building in the world. We have to write a thriller together set here, because Doug was also interested in writing fiction. He submitted a mystery to me. Mm-hmm. And so that was the birth of Relic, and it took 7 or 8 years before it actually was published. And that's too long a story and too sad a story to tell, but it had a happy ending. So all you aspiring writers out there, I hope you'll take heart from what happened to us.
All right, Doug, you want to correct him on any points?
No, that's the full story. It was pretty remarkable. I remember when he called me up on the phone and identified himself as a senior editor at St. Martin's Press, and would I care to meet him for lunch at the Russian Tea Room, mm-hmm. which is one of the most expensive restaurants in New York City. And I had to rush out to the Salvation Army and buy a jacket so I could get into the Russian Tea Room. But I remember arriving, looking around for this very gray-haired, eminent editor that I was expecting, and all I saw was this kid in the back of the restaurant waving at me. He was younger than I was, mm-hmm. and that was Lincoln Child. He was a brilliant rising editor. He'd already become a senior editor at St. Martin's Press, and he was, I think, only 23, 24 years old. So
I think a bit older than that, but not by much.
Yeah, so,
I was younger than him. I still am, but I've graded. Now I'm that grizzled old person he was looking for.
Yeah, he's not bald though, and he's not even that gray, but nope. He's getting there.
Yeah.
But it was kind of funny because, people ask us, well, where did Pendergast come from?
Mm-hmm.
And, neither one of us had worked, like any kind of writing partnership before. And so I wrote the first few chapters of Relic, and I had two, and I sent them to Lincoln, because he was my editor at St. Martin. So originally, I did most of the writing, and then he did the rewriting and editing and so forth. So I sent him the first 3 chapters, and he called me up and he said, "Doug, these are great. These are fantastic chapters, but there's a problem. You got these 2 cops. One is Irish and one is Italian." And he said, "Doug, they're kind of the same character, kind of rough, working class, on the outside, heart of gold on the inside." He said, "Why don't we fold these 2 characters together and make one out of it? And then let's come up with a totally different detective, someone that no one has thought up before." And by this time, I was thoroughly irritated at being criticized. And so I said very sarcastically, "Oh, yeah, like what we need is like an albino from New Orleans." And Lincoln said, "Let's work with that. Okay, he's not albino, he's just very pale." And, and then I said, "Oh, yeah, okay, and he wears black. He only wears black suits. And when he's at the murder scene, he's mistaken for the Undertaker." Mm-hmm. And then Lincoln added another detail, and we went back and forth like that. And in 15 minutes, Pendergast was standing in front of us, fully formed. And I don't even remember where the name came from, who invented the name. Do you remember, Link?
You must have, because it was you who went back, sulking and rewrote the chapters. So I'm assuming it was you.
Well, it might have been, although we did talk about who this guy was before I wrote those chapters. So, and he really is an invention of both of ours. I mean, and people have asked us, well, is Pendergast like a real person or did you take characteristics from other people? And our answer, my answer is, Pendergast is the person I'd like to be, but I'm not. Mm-hmm. Wish I were. I don't know. How about you, Lincoln? Is that...
Yes, and not only that, but I think Doug will agree with me that we did 2 things, or 3 things, when we put Pendergast together. As Doug said, he materialized, there. He wrote the first draft, and I saw this character who was sort of a cynical, standing back a little bit, like Monty Woolley in The Man Who Came to Dinner, or a film like that. Mm-hmm. And I pounced on that sort of, mordant humor of his, and that the droll, a distance between him and the quotidian day-to-day duties of police work. And I really liked that. And so I remembered a character from an old movie called Green for Danger, mm-hmm. who had a very whimsical, sense of humor, and I added some of that into it. And I also wanted to be wealthy, and so, as Doug said, we gave him qualities we both had, so I gave him... Yeah?
We both wanted, neither one of us were wealthy. In fact, we were both pretty damn poor at the time. Well,
both things, which we still can't afford, unfortunately. But things that we would have liked to have either been, in terms of character, attributes or a history. Although the more we wrote about Pendergast, once he was established, a lot of things began to creep into his life that were dark in terms of his own self and in terms of what happened to him. Mm-hmm. That, of course, we wouldn't want to have happen to us.
Sure. And that actually dovetails really nicely into a question that we've got from the audience. And again, as I say with every time I do this, if I mispronounce your username, I apologize. So Lottle Ghosty wants to know, who is more Pendergast between the 2 of you?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. I don't believe we've ever been asked that question before. It's interesting. I guess I'd have to say that we both contribute to Pendergast's elevated tastes, in the sense that, I'm a lover of fine wine. I, wish I could afford better wines than I drink, but once in a while I get a chance to taste a wine. Also, both of us are lovers of the English language and of fine literature. What are some of Pendergast's other loves? I mean, Pendergast loves music, classical music. He's not a fan of opera, but he likes symphonic music, and that's something and I do.
He's a medievalist. He's a classicist. He's
a polyglot. He speaks 5 languages, I think.
Yeah, at least. I think he's also working on Linear B right now too. And he loves all things fine, whether they be firearms or wines, pens, clothes, and gives Doug and I a chance to indulge our own whims and wishes. I think that Pendergast has some of my reclusivity. I'm not a misanthrope, but I'm perfectly comfortable in my domain, and I think he has some of Doug's, and I'm going to give Doug some props here. So Doug's courage, because I would never go down to the damn jungles of Honduras like Doug did, and or sneak onto Hart Island, knowing he was going to get arrested. And Doug has that. It doesn't always work out well, that precipitousness gets us into trouble sometimes too. But it's a level of keeping the G rated. It takes a certain something,
Bold as brass, one might say.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
You owe that one.
Yeah.
Thank you. I owe you one now, partner.
So let's talk about partnership then. What is it like with the creative process and the writing process, the two of you working together to co-write this book that feels like such a unique sort of relationship, and to have been doing it, as we were sort of discussing earlier, for coming on 30 years now?
Well, I think Lincoln and I have worked out a very good way of operating. I mean, for a while there, I thought our partnership was a bit like a bad marriage. We were constantly sniping at each other and irritated, but the thing about working with Lincoln is that I trust his judgment. So when I've written something and I give it to him and he tells me, "Oh, Doug, this doesn't work," or "This is crap," or whatever, sometimes he can be rather blunt. After I cool off, I realize he's right. I mean, and the same is true when I criticize him. So we both bring out the best in each other through challenge. But starting with Diablo Mesa, or using Diablo Mesa as an example, that was a book where the basic idea was mine. I thought, wouldn't it be cool if the book had something to do with the Roswell incident? This idea that a UFO crashed there in 1947 was covered up by the government. But we can't make it hokey. It can't be, hokey, dead aliens, autopsies and all that stuff. Let's try to make it a lot more scientifically valid and real. And so, I brought this idea to Lincoln, and then Lincoln and I had a number of conversations about it, refining it and making it, much more of less science fiction and much more science fact. And so it started off as being an accurate, meticulous, professional archaeological excavation of the Roswell site to see what might be found. And then we came up with the idea, and I think this might have been Lincoln's, where they don't find a UFO right away. Right away, they find 2 homicide victims from 1947, when the UFO was supposed to have crashed, whose faces and hands have been obliterated with acid in an attempt to try to cover up their identity. And this, I know that Link really spun this idea that we could work in the whole atomic spy situation that occurred with the Soviets spying on the Americans' development of the H-bomb up at Los Alamos, which is also in New Mexico. So that's sort of how the idea started. Maybe I'll turn it over to Link to talk about how we actually write together, the actual process of it, which has kind of evolved over time.
Yes, thank you. The way we tend to work now is we always have a superfluity of ideas. That's not a problem. It's getting the right idea and spinning it out and knowing in advance that when we are done in 18 months or so, that we've arrived at the place we wanted to be at. So we start, once the idea has formed, we begin just BSing, brainstorming back and forth. And that's what I meant, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Just, Doug will give you some ideas and I'll turn in ideas, and then eventually we'll begin to write out a document which goes back and forth many times. Finally, we get to a stage where we are ready to assign the chapters. Mm-hmm. And we always are very careful to assign those chapters in a sensible way. In other words, Doug will write a sequence, and I will write a series of chapters involving a chase, or I'll write a bunch of chapters from one person's point of view. So there isn't any kind of roughness from chapter to chapter. It flows smoothly. I mean, when bounces back to you, when you read our books, do you ever get the sense, whoops, it's like when you get out of the freeway and you hit a different kind of road, mm-hmm. Do you ever get the sense that you're reading somebody else's prose?
I don't think that I've ever felt like, hey, I've shifted from highway to gravel, or like a real sharp change. I think, knowing that there were two authors behind the wheel, I try, subconsciously to find little things. I honestly don't really think I've ever felt a big disconnect. I mean, maybe there's been, shifts in speed. We're very much in an action sequence, and then we're shifting perspectives, and now things slow down a little bit. Or our moment has ended, and now we're moving on to the next, part of the story. But I've never felt like, oh, wait a minute, all of a sudden we're using, very grandiose language, and we hadn't been doing that before. I think you guys blend it very seamlessly.
Well, thank you. That's partly a result of us, rewriting each other several times to try and achieve that smoothness, and it's also partly our own styles merging to some degree. I mean, somebody we were speaking to last night put it very well when she said that as individual novelists, Doug has his own voice, I have my own voice, and when we write together, we create a third voice, which is in some ways better than the sum of its parts.
And it's interesting because it's a third voice that isn't a blending of our two voices so much as it's a third unique voice. Mm-hmm. That's what puzzles me. I don't really quite understand even how that happens even while we're doing it. But it's like when we write together, it's a third voice entirely. Mm-hmm. It isn't meeting halfway. He meets my voice halfway, I meet his. It's something different. Wouldn't you say, Lincoln? Or
yes, and I'd also say that I can't speak for you, but for me, I find myself rewriting or revising Doug's chapters a lot less now than I did 15, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Just because I think our voices have matured, and as we find our own voice, we've also found that third mingled voice.
Mm-hmm.
The voice of Preston Child, its own entity. So I've got another question here from the audience. This is Busybody Boyo. They'd like to know, what would you advise for people starting out as writing partners?
Writing partners?
Yeah.
That's a very specific question, and I'll take a stab at it. Doug can add to it if he wants to. I assume that you're speaking about fiction, because nonfiction is much more common and much easier. It's also a lot more accepted in the publishing community, at least historically. Mm-hmm. But the most important thing you have to do is, other than the obvious, find the right partner, is to check your ego at the door. So many partnerships, musical, literary, marital, whatever they may be, get broken up because of damaged egos, and somebody gets on their high horse and somebody gets on their higher horse and then their high-ish horse and so on. You can't do that, and that requires respecting the other person, as Doug said.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, one of the main failings that I've noticed, because I've done a lot of teaching of writing, and I've noticed that the people who become really successful writers are the ones who are welcome criticism, even if it's really painful. And the more they welcome criticism, and the more they criticize themselves and are hard on themselves, the faster they progress as a writer. And those writers who never progress, who sort of, and I know, it's terrible. You realize that this is a person who's not going to make it as a writer, are the ones who feel that what they've written is so precious and so perfect, and become so offended at any kind of criticism that they just can't bear it. And they never get any better. And they don't know how to revise their work. They don't know how to tear it apart and put it back together. So a writing partnership, if you're not going to tear apart your work and your writing partner's work, and if you're not receptive to your partner's criticism and trust that partner, you're not going to succeed in a partnership, and you may not even succeed writing solo books.
I think that's a great answer, and I think that's great. You both gave great advice for not just, literary partnerships, but partnerships in general. It's got to be a willingness to, be open and take constructive criticism. And yeah, the number of times that I've read something and really, really enjoyed it and loved it, I have to remind myself that that's not the first brush. No one is a genius at first pen stroke. Or at least I hope not. That's how I sleep at night, is believing that we all have to work really hard.
It's true.
Good, yay. So I wanted to sort of shift gears a little bit and talk about you both a little separately. Lincoln, since you're the one on my screen, we're gonna start with you. So you alluded to the fact that you were working at St. Martin's Press. I learned that you also were the founder of the horror fiction genre part of St. Martin's Press. What pieces of that did you bring into your writing here? Because I think that with both Pendergast and Nora Kelly's stories, there's an element of horror. I think they're scary. What are some of the things you've looked for? How has that been part of this?
I think I can speak for both Doug and myself, as we both love and have always loved thrillers. But I've had a particular love since 8th grade, when I discovered H.P. Lovecraft, for horror in particular. And then that branched out into ghost stories and somewhat less, in-your-face material. But at St. Martin's Press, we were the first, I believe, hardcover press to branch out and form a mass market division. And they asked me to head the division that would bring out horror, ghost, occult, supernatural books. And so, I'd already published 2 anthologies of ghost stories for them at that time. And so, I began spending a lot of time grooming horror authors and people who worked around horror authors. And Doug indulged me quite a bit, and I know that he also likes this. But I think that our horror, especially in the earlier books, manifested itself in, for example, the sub-basement of the museum. In a Lovecraft story, there's always a sub-basement underneath the basement, and then they find out that the sub-basement was chiseled up from below rather than vice versa, and then everything goes downhill from there. Our ultraviolet, so to speak, was based to some degree on the grisly books of blood written by Clive Barker, but we also learned a lot from M.R. James, the old antiquarian and ghost story writer of the Edwardian age. who knew just how to tease you enough so that when you were least expecting it, you get hit between the eyes with the awful, awful thing that we've been hiding. And so, combining all these loves of ghostly and supernatural fiction, one thing that Doug and I were careful to do, though, was to always make sure, almost always, there was a scientific structure in place. At least at the beginning, if you lay down a concrete subfloor, then you can build on that, and eventually the reader now has a suspension of disbelief. And when you get into the more outre things like brain eating and shape shifting, they'll go along with you. And we always try and leave it so that if people want to believe there's a scientific explanation, they can believe that. If they want to go with something else, more power to them.
And we do have another question from the audience here. This one's from Tyler. Why are there no scary werewolf books?
Well, Tyler has to read my solo novel, Full Wolf Moon.
There you go. There's your answer, because you haven't read it yet, Tyler. That's
not intending a plug here, but that answers the question.
No. That's a great answer, both of them. And so let me shift gears a little bit over to you, Douglas, if I can. It's already been alluded that you have gone on many adventures. I did a little bit of research because I'm a nerd, and I mean, you have been all over the world. You have looked for treasure. You have explored lost cities. How much of that have you brought into the writing process? How do you sort of filter that? Do you find inspiration out in the world and you go, oh, I just did this crazy thing and we have to write about it now? What's that like for you?
Yeah, that's a lot of what goes into our books. I remember one of the very earliest books that Lincoln and I wrote called Riptide was based on the Oak Island treasure. And I spent 3 weeks on Oak Island with these treasure hunters, and I did a story for Smithsonian Magazine about it. And I was later told, years later, the magazine told me that it was the most popular story that they had ever published. And when Lincoln heard that, he said, Doug, we have got to write a novel based on that story. And so we did, and that became Riptide, and we moved it from Canada to an island off the Maine coast. We came up with a really interesting idea. The real story involves a booby-trapped treasure pit that 3 people had died in. It's really ingeniously designed, and even in the 20th or 21st century, they can't get to the bottom of it because of the booby traps and the flow of water. So Lincoln came up with this brilliant idea that our pirate named Macallan had kidnapped an English architect who's based on Sir Christopher Wren, and asked him to design an impenetrable treasure chamber where he could hide this vast treasure that he'd won, and that no one could get it but him, and it'd be booby trapped, so that if anyone else tried to get the treasure, they'd perish. And Lincoln came up with this fabulous idea that it would be an upside down cathedral spire, so that this English architect, instead of, he designed churches like Sir Christopher Wren, instead designed an upside down spire with the treasure at the bottom. It was a pit. And so I guess that just gives you one example. Another time I did a story for the New Yorker magazine. I write for the New Yorker on archaeological issues on prehistoric cannibalism in the American Southwest. Really horrifying discoveries that were being made by archaeologists about a period of unbelievably brutal and bloody cannibalism that occurred in this American Southwest in New Mexico, the Four Corners area, around 1000 AD, 1200 AD. So I wrote this story for the New Yorker, and Lincoln then said, Doug, let's write a novel about that, about a search for this lost city that, and they find, so that became Thunderhead. And it's gone on like that. So I brought quite a few nonfiction ideas to the table, but then Lincoln, with his brilliant imagination, has often been the one to figure out how to turn it into a story. There's a huge gap, and this is something else that if readers are if people are listening to us who are aspiring authors, it's very important to point out that there's a huge gulf between the idea and the plot. And so many writers or aspiring writers think, I've got a great idea. But that's only 10% of the work. The other 90% is plotting it out. So I'll bring to the table some of these nonfiction ideas, but then Lincoln and I working together will then work out the plot. And that's really the hard part.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great answer. So this is sort of for both of you and segues into the next, sort of set of questions that I've got pretty well. I have, as a bookseller, and I think I told you this before we started, always sold your books as mundane explanations for mystical things happening. That's part of the fun for me as a reader, was always trying to figure out, okay, so you've painted this corner, everything feels so magical, it's got to be supernatural, how could it possibly not be? And then getting the explanation at the end and learning something along the way. In both your experiences with sort of these phenomena, whether it's the Oak Island treasure, I mean, let's use it as an example. Do you think there's treasure at the bottom of that? Is that do you believe that that's actually, there's something down there, or is it just urban myth for you guys?
I think there is, and I think between Doug's article and our book, we probably bankrupted more corporations, going up there. And certainly, I don't know about Doug, but I sure as hell hope there is something down there. It makes the world a more interesting place.
Yeah.
Well, the question can also be applied to our current book, Diablo Mesa. Do we really believe that a UFO crashed at the Roswell site? A lot of people think it's been debunked. And our main character, Nora Kelly, who's an archaeologist, is fired by the Santa Fe Archaeological Institute because she refuses to undertake an archaeological excavation of the Roswell site because she thinks it's all bogus. So the question is, do we really believe it? Mm-hmm. Well, the answer is probably we shouldn't give you our answer because it might give away the end of the book. But I believe, and I think Lincoln would agree, that we have come up with a very plausible explanation that no one else had really advanced before for the Roswell incident. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say we're right, because I think that there's still some debate about it. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly plausible. I mean, would you agree, Link?
Yes, and I would take Drew's description of what we do and turn it on its head. If he says we take the strange and explain it in a mundane way that all can understand, I think we often take something mundane and lift the veil and show what's not what everybody thinks is going on. For example, in the new book, Diablo Mesa, everybody has an opinion about what happened there. Either it's the X-Files and aliens and taken away on secret railway to Area 51 or whatever, or else it's just a weather balloon or, whatever. And that's it. And we say, well, no, there's a third possibility that nobody's thought about, and it's rather unsettling. It's very unsettling, actually. And what if this is the case? And you never thought about it. So we really like taking ideas that people, not cliched ideas, I don't mean to imply that, but ideas people think they know, like John James Audubon, for example, in Fever Dream. We show a whole new side to the naturalist and the bird painter that wasn't known before. Of course, we made a lot of it up, but that's beside the point. And so we take the mundane and try and give it a new twist.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another question from the audience. This is from GW. How much research is involved in writing each novel?
Well, really a great deal of research. One of the things that we really feel we want to do in our novels is bring the reader into another world and bring them a lot of information that they haven't had before. So, for example, in Diablo Mesa, we have a tremendous amount of information, solid information, scientific, not bogus stuff, on UFOs, or as they're now known as, unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs. This is stuff that's really been collected by sober scientists and the military and so forth, who, from Enrico Fermi on, he was the one who created the Fermi paradox, which we discuss in the book, which is, if there is intelligent life elsewhere in the galaxy, where the heck are they? And Fermi was the one who first posed that question. So we go into a lot of that. So readers who come into our novels are really educated in subjects that are not fantastical or made up, but actually real. And so that takes a lot of research. And I know that Lincoln and I often divide up the research so that he'll take certain things, I'll take other things, and then we work them into the chapters we're writing.
And sometimes we learn things, often we learn things in the process. I used to answer your similar questions to yours by saying we pick subjects we'd like to know more about, as well as subjects that we happen to, Doug knows a lot about certain things, I know a fair amount about other things, but things we want to learn about. But in writing this book, Diablo Mesa, I learned some things that were fascinating. And I'm sitting here trying to remember the damn name of that. What is that name of that barrier, Doug? That
the barrier? What barrier?
At which point civilizations no longer.
You're talking about the possible answer to the Fermi paradox, which is that at a certain point these civilizations self-destruct, and so as a result they're all long gone. We're just really young.
Yeah, that's right. There's what is the term for that? But yes, it's the reason is that intelligent species only last a very short period of time because they eventually acquire the means to destroy themselves and do so. It's called the Great Filter, actually.
That's right. Okay, yeah. Good for you. And one possibility is, and this I'd never heard of this before until we began researching the book. But of course, it immediately, 100 ideas came into my head, and I called Doug and said, "Hey, let's work this in this or that way," because it's not only the idea that a race reaches a point where it can annihilate itself, and then promptly it does so with nuclear arms or whatever, but there are other possibilities out there, which people who believe in them are arguing that we shouldn't be doing. Beaming information out into space, especially actively, because that may arouse interest that we don't want to have aroused.
Yeah, that's the old Chinese the old curse was, may you live in interesting times, but the second part of that curse is, may you come to the attention of the authorities. And, our beaming, streaming electromagnetic radiation out into space, which is in an expanding sphere at light speed away from the Earth, we might attract the attention of the authorities.
Yeah.
Or somebody who wants to serve man, as the Twilight Zone put it.
Someone out there is hungry yes. And in the dark. You guys actually ended up answering the follow-up question I had, which was, what's your favorite explanation for the Fermi paradox? So shifting it a little bit then, let's talk a little bit about Nora Kelly and sort of her genesis, the inspiration for her, because it felt a lot like in reading the Pendergast books, he's very worldly. Again, speaks all these languages and likes all these fine things, and very, at times feeling almost European, and at times feeling just very different. Whereas Nora and her adventures feel much more rooted in Americana. The first book takes place with the Donner Party. The second book, in fairness, is a mummy adventure, but again, there's something kind of, American about we find a mummy. And then this most recent book is Roswell. So was that intentional? Was there a decision made like, hey, we're gonna, move into this kind of realm? Was it not? I know I asked like 8 questions there, so pick the one you like, I guess.
I'll start. Doug can continue if he wants. I would simply say that Nora's genesis was in the period before Pendergast had become our main character. Mm-hmm. He was not a serious character early on, and we were writing solo books. Mm-hmm. Doug mentioned Riptide. She appeared in Thunderhead, which was the book Doug referred to in terms of the Anasazi and the cannibalism that went on in 1,000 years ago. And so, it was set in the Southwest, and we had to create a new character. And so we came up, Doug did a lot of this since he lives in New Mexico 6 months out of the year. A character who was an archaeologist, obviously, and who had a brother who had real problems, and whose father was an old treasure hunter who died out and, starved to death, believing that the lost city of gold was out there. And so, later on, once she became a part of the Pendergast universe, so to speak, and then moved beyond Pendergast and became her own character, she dragged her past along with her. Mm-hmm. And so there are several characters, including, not Corey Swanson, but Nora certainly is a character we invented in which Pendergast initially played no role at all. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you say, Doug?
Yeah, that's right. Well, and then she moved from New Mexico to New York and worked at the Museum of Natural History, and then that's how she met Pendergast, and then she went back to New Mexico. So there's a whole universe there of interlocking characters. Mm-hmm. And Corey was another character that Pendergast encountered in other books, but Corey and Nora had never met each other until the beginning of this series. This is Diablo Mesa is the third book in a series. The first was Old Bones, the second was The Scorpion's Tail. They all take place, they all are books about and Corey, who is a young, newly minted FBI agent, and Nora, who's an archaeologist, and they work together. And each book is a standalone. It's not a series where you have to read the books in order, but each one involves some crazy, discovery of human remains. Mm-hmm. And is it a murder? Well, the FBI has to investigate homicides, and an archaeologist has to dig up, prehistoric human remains, or so that they often find themselves working together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess a good follow-up question for that would be, what's something? Let me preface this by saying I try, not perfectly, to keep our stuff spoiler light. I think spoiler free is too hard to do, but spoiler light. So with Diablo Mesa, what is something really unexpected that you learned in the process of either researching the book or writing it? What's something that you gained some new insight on?
Well, maybe I'll answer that question, because there's part of what Diablo Mesa involves is Soviet espionage of the American H-bomb project. Now, that's not the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, but after 1945, the secret city of Los Alamos began developing the hydrogen bomb, which is hundreds of times more powerful than the regular atomic bomb. Mm-hmm. It's a fusion weapon as opposed to fission. So we did a lot of research into the development of the H-bomb, and we came across some stuff that was information that was previously classified. Maybe it still is classified, I don't know. But anyway, about how they control the yield on the H-bomb. Mm-hmm. And inside the hydrogen bomb is a device called a dial-a-yield, which even as the bomb is being loaded on the plane, they can actually adjust the yield from 1 megaton or half a megaton to 25, 30, 40 megatons by turning a dial and adjusting the amount of tritium, which is the form of hydrogen, which is fused by the fission bomb. This gets very technical, but so there's this device, and that device, it turns out, is at the center of the plot of Diablo Mesa. And I'd never heard of that device before. It sounds almost like something out of dial-a-yield. It sounds like a joke, but it's actually a highly sophisticated device. And of course, the Soviets had their own similar device. If there are devices like that on hydrogen bombs today, we don't know, because that's all completely classified. But the early hydrogen bombs did have this device where right before you sent the plane off, if you wanted to blow up an entire city, you turn the dial up to 50 megatons, full fry, or if you're just going to bomb a missile silo, you turn it down to 1 megaton, which would just be, lightly crispy.
Uh-huh.
Right. These days, they probably use cell phones to dial the thing and, change the yield.
It's an emoji now. There's a smiley face, a frowny face, an angry face.
That's an area where our imaginations obviously deviate from historical research. But and I already answered your question about with the great filter. Mm-hmm. So it's one of the great things about being writers, whose curiosities, stay alive, is that we always are learning new things. And we try and pass those that we think are useful on to our readers.
Yeah, no, and as I said, as a reader of yours for a long time, I've definitely felt that way. Again, whether it's learning about different chemical compositions that can lead to things that look like spontaneous combustion, or historical inaccuracies and how we tend to interpret information and data. There's a lot of really cool stuff there. My degree was in American history, and so it was always kind of fun getting to read back and go, oh yeah, no, I know what's going on here. So let's talk a little bit more about Nora and sort of and Diablo Mesa. You've alluded to the espionage angle. We've talked a little bit about that. What was the process like trying to learn about that? Because obviously there's some stuff that's still classified. There's some stuff that's been declassified. Is there do you have to write someone at the Department of Defense and go, hey, we're writing about atomic weapons and we have questions, but just for research purposes, can you tell us how or is it more holistic? What's that like? Because that's a very unique area, I feel, to write in.
What happens, at least in this particular book, is that we find out what sources are readily available. Sometimes we talk to people who were in the know and have unclassified things they can tell us, and then beyond that, we let our imaginations run rampant in such a way that the reader never knows what's real and what isn't. And I think that not only keeps, I don't know about Doug, but I don't want to get a black bag put over my head and sent to Guantanamo. So, we don't get into the nitty gritty of secret stuff, but we learn what's the most interesting things about what's actually available out there. For example, did you know that for a few years Russians use steel for all their fillings in people's teeth?
I didn't know
that. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. We didn't know that either. It's obviously, this is the 50s or 40s. It's obviously not secret, but it made a lot of difference to our book. And, as we learn things from our research, from what's out there, we then spin it out. And one of the most fun things that we have and to enjoy is when people come back and ask us more questions about the things that are, totally our imagination. Certain mystical practices of Pendergast come to mind, for example. And we get asked, how somebody can achieve the 18th stage of enlightenment following his doctrine. And so, I don't mean to be coy, but we like to leave that a gray area between where our research stops and our imaginations take over.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we did for this book was we researched the real espionage. I mean, the Soviets were spying on the H-bomb project and on the Atomic Manhattan Project, and a lot of that spying took place in Santa Fe, which was the drop-off point for scientists going up to Los Alamos, which was at the time a secret city. And it turns out that I live 2 blocks from the bridge, the Delgado Street Bridge in Santa Fe, where the secrets of the Manhattan Project were dead dropped and picked up by the Rosenbergs or whatever, and then passed on to the Soviets. There was a Klaus Fuchs was a scientist up in the Manhattan Project who was who took a whole bunch of the secrets of the atomic bomb and hid them under that bridge, and then they were picked up and got to the Soviet Union. And in fact, Stalin knew about the atomic bomb, certain aspects of the atomic bomb, even before Roosevelt did, and then Truman, but Roosevelt both during the time of the development of the bomb. So.
And the trucks that carried plutonium up there went over that same bridge, and they'd splash a bit here and there, and that's why Doug glows in the dark the way he does.
That's super interesting. I didn't, derailing for just a second, being a history nerd, I didn't realize, was it confirmed that the Rosenbergs had passed on secrets? I remember, my understanding of it was that it was always like they contended they were innocent and there wasn't certainty. Did we decide? We decided now. Is that?
Yeah, we did. When the Soviet archives were made available, it turned out, yes, indeed, they were atomic spies. However, Ethel Rosenberg took the fall for her brother David Greenglass. So she probably shouldn't have been executed because she wasn't really that involved. But she took the fall for her brother, who was much more involved. But the real villain was Klaus Fuchs, and he got away with it. He did get arrested but he was British. I mean, he was German originally, but he was British. He was a British citizen. He'd been brought into the Manhattan Project by the British supplied scientists for it. And he was arrested in Britain and tried and convicted of espionage. And he spent like 15 years in prison, and then he then was released and went and defected to the Soviet Union. But he was the bad guy. He was the number one bad guy of the Manhattan Project. He was really a bad guy.
All right, we've got a little bit of time left. I want to just knock out a couple more questions to anyone who's in the audience. If you've been holding on to a question, waiting for your moment, this is your moment. So go ahead and write it in, and I will make sure to get your questions asked. So, in writing this book, what was something that was what was a hard piece to write? Was there anything that you really struggled, feeling like, I don't feel like we really have got it right, or I'm not liking the way this is feeling? What was a difficult piece for you?
I can answer that without giving too much away. In Act 3, our characters had to penetrate something that was meant to be impenetrable. And Doug and I said, we've done this before, not obviously not in the same way. We never repeat ourselves, but we've been in similar scenarios before. How are we going to make this different? And we did. And I can't say it for spoiler reasons, but we planted a sleeper agent of our own early in the book, who made that infiltration possible. But that was difficult because we always try very hard to make sure that we never repeat ourselves, that we're always fresh, that nobody ever thinks that we're phoning it in. I can't stand that phrase, but you hear it now and then, and I suppose some people do, but we would never think of that.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions coming in already. This first one is from Rachel Canalti. What is the key to enlightenment, since you brought it up?
Kool-Aid.
Kool-Aid. Okay, any particular flavor?
No, I better not say that because,
that's an awful thing to say, Lincoln. Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Do you think of Jim Jones? Is that what you think?
Yeah.
I
take that back.
Lincoln has a very dark mind. Actually, I spent a week with the Dalai Lama years ago in 1991. He came to Santa Fe, and I was very friendly with the Tibetan community in Santa Fe. There's an expatriate community, and they asked me if I would act as his press secretary while he was here, because he didn't travel at that time with any. He just traveled with a bunch of monks, and I was with him when he wanted to see skiing, so he took him up to the ski basin above Santa Fe, and we were in the ski lodge, and he was ordering hot chocolate, and one of the waitresses just sat down next to him and said, I want to ask you a question. What is the meaning of life? And he answered it. He said, I'll try to imitate his accent. He said, that question, what is meaning of life? Very easy question to answer. Answer is to be happy. That is meaning of life. Hard question. How to be happy? That hard question.
And for that, you need to take my course.
There you go.
I want to point out very quickly that when I said Kool-Aid, I never thought of Jim Jones. It was just the first thing that popped into my mind. Like when you asked earlier, what does Pendergast have for breakfast? I said Frosted Flakes. Mm-hmm. There was no hidden meaning there except being...
No, he's getting paid by Kellogg's on the side to promote their Frosted Flakes.
That's the real conspiracy.
Yes.
All right, we've got two more. Hans Engelmeyer wants to know, will this be the final year of the Preston-Child partnership?
Does Hans know something we don't?
I'm curious now, Hans. So,
the answer, we could make jokes about that, but I think we're not going to. The answer is absolutely not. We are going strong. We're both very young. We're both in our late 40s, early, mid 40s. No, but anyway, we are going strong, and we have so many ideas and so many books we want to write that this is going to go on well into our dotage. So,
well, as a reader of those books, I'm excited about that, and that ties in pretty well with our last audience question and second to last question of the night. This is Busybody Boyo again. Is there more Nora Kelly coming?
Definitely. We're working on it right now. We have the idea fully formed, and we're writing the opening chapters.
Yes, and
more than a peek.
And speaking of Kool-Aid, I won't say any more about it, but this novel involves a fanatical religious cult.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So I'll bring us home with sort of the final question of the evening. It's a purely fun one, but it's the one that I think flummoxes people the most. But we're going to do a little twist on it because there are two of you here. Normally I ask, hey, who do you feel is your authorial doppelganger? Someone who you feel you write like stylistically, or you're like, oh, I emulate that writer. I feel like we're really similar. But instead, I'm going to ask you, who do you think your partner's authorial doppelganger is? Who do you feel they write like?
Oh God!
I know. See,
I think no. I shouldn't. I was gonna make a joke, but I won't. That's a very good question.
Thank you.
I think Doug. I don't read as much thrillers these days as I should, but I think that Doug writes a lot like Jeffrey Household. The British writer of thrillers from the mid-century. They're very erudite, but they're also full of action. Mm-hmm. And even though most of the Household books I think are first person, I get the same sense of excitement and this action just sort of tingling around the periphery of my vision when I read those books as I do when I read Doug's stuff.
Awesome.
Well, thank you, Lincoln. The Rogue Male is really one of the greatest thrillers ever written. So I certainly appreciate that. Let's see. I think for you, I'll preface this by saying that Link has a very twisted, dark imagination, and I mean that in a good way. And so when we are writing our novels, Link is the one who writes like, for example, with Cabinet of Curiosities, he wrote the chapters from Dr. Ling's point of view because he has this amazing creative insight into the dark workings of a mind like Ling. So I would say Francis Hodgson, am I pronouncing that right? Who wrote The House on the Borderlands and a number of other very, very dark, strange, and terrifying books. I'd have to say that Lincoln kind of his very interesting and creative mind resembles that writer. So was an extraordinary writer, British as well. Wasn't he British, Lincoln?
Yes, he was. He died in World War I in the trenches. Yeah.
So he was another author I think people should read. He's been neglected, but he was
Yes.
a genius.
William Hope Hodgson, by all means. Well,
thank you. I got his name wrong.
No, you didn't. William Hope Hodgson. I was afraid you were going to compare me to John Milton. That quote of Samuel Johnson, "Paradise Lost is a great book, and no one wished it any longer."
So for what it's worth, when I think of, we talk about Preston Childs sort of having its own voice as an author, and it's not a synthesis; it's almost sort of a creation in itself. If you've ever read Midnight Scholar, John M. Ford was an author who wrote these thrillery, science fiction-y fantasy mysteries in the mid-90s, really the late 80s into the 90s, and then passed away, and they just recently got them republished. Your writing, both of your writing, has always felt very similar to me to that as well.
John M. Ford?
I believe it was John M. Ford. Now I'm saying it out loud.
And I'm going to make a note of that. I'll read that. What
the
was
book
the title?
was the one that I'm thinking of in particular was called Midnight Scholar. It's about a history professor who's got a partner in England. The partner investigates historical, archaeological finds and mysteries, and they go missing, and the Soviets are involved, and there's a briefcase, and there's, potentially Excalibur has been rediscovered, and he has to leave Harvard and travel to East Germany and sort of play games with the Stasi. It's really interesting. It's a cool book, and he wrote another one, the Dragon. It's not the Dragon Prophecies. It doesn't matter. Point being, when I think of that unique voice you were talking about, that's a very, very similar to me.
Well, the only John Ford I've heard of makes movies, or did. So I'll look that up with great interest. Thank you.
And someone will come by in the comments later and tell me how wrong I was, and that's not his name, and how could I dare say that, and that's fine too. All right, so now I have to shamelessly-ish plug my store and in your book. So if you liked this tonight, if you went, gee, Diablo Mesa sounds good, or I'd want to read more about this Pendergast guy, or more about Nora Kelly, I want to read more of these, mystical things explained in a mundane way, or mundane things explained in a mystical way, you can get this book and many others at Town Book Center. We are located in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. We are right across the street from the largest Wegmans in the country, I think. If you're not comfortable shopping with us in person, or if you're not local to Pennsylvania but you still want to support a great local bookstore, you can always shop with us online at townbc.com. That's TOWNE, B as in Bravo, C as in Charlie.com. I want to thank my guests for being here tonight. Honestly, guys, this was a lot of fun for me. I wish I could go back to 13-year-old me who first read Still Life with Crows and go, hey man, you're gonna meet those guys one day. It's gonna be really cool. This was great for me, and I really hope you guys had a wonderful time as well.
Thanks, Drew. You were an excellent. The questions you asked were excellent.
Yeah, Drew, thank you very much. You were a wonderful interviewer. We really enjoyed this.
And to your audience as well. Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, they were some really good ones.
And the support, too.
Yeah. All right, so with that being said, guys, if you don't mind, like, subscribe, share this video, and always make sure to check back with us. We have author events going on, it feels like every day for the next 2 months, which I'm excited about because, honestly, it beats the alternative. So, we will see you all next time. Thanks again, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.